Well, Justin Trudeau's Liberals campaigned on a lot of big promises and faced high expectations when they swept into office. 2 years in, some of those promises remain unfulfilled, and for some, momentum has slowed. But there are 2 years left in their mandate. So what should we expect? Here to talk about that, the insiders, Kathleen Monk in Ottawa, Jamie Watt and David Hurley in Toronto. I'm going to start with the middle class because we heard a lot about that during the campaign. Jamie, has he delivered on his promises to make the middle class prosper?
Well, I think he's got a good start on it. He promised to do three things when he was elected, essentially. One was to cut taxes for the middle class and those aspiring to join it. One was to spend money to get the infrastructure going. And three was not to be Stephen Harper. And I think, you know, all things considered, he's done pretty well on those things. There's always a bit of a lull at the midterm, and so I think he's going to have to take note of that. But I think they're in pretty good shape, all things considered. David,
do you think the middle class feels like they've prospered under this government?
Well, I think they certainly are better off under this government, and I think because of the tax cuts that Jamie mentioned, but also the massive redistribution of the child benefit. And I think that that's where I would encourage the government to keep focused on. They shouldn't get complacent about a strong economy, because for a lot of Canadians, whether the GDP is going up, whether the unemployment rate is low, doesn't tell them anything anymore about their own personal fortunes and whether they're better off or worse off. And the government was on the right track, intervening to address the excesses of what the market is delivering in terms of compensation to people, and they need to keep focused on that regardless of what the macroeconomic metrics are.
Okay, so Kathleen, David mentioned the economy. It's growing. We're in a good growth phase. How much does that help the government? And if it weren't there, how much in trouble would they be?
Yeah, well, listen, I think there's going to be the fiscal update this week, Tuesday, and there's going to be lots of good news. If we rewind, actually, 2 years ago when this government was first elected, there were darker clouds on the horizon economically for this government. But it's turned out that Trudeau's sunny ways have, in fact, been a bit sunny in terms of the economy. But the challenge that this government has going forward is really going to be making sure that those like the people that David has just described, you know, who are feeling squeezed, who don't feel that they can make ends meet, who are having a harder time in the economy, actually get a bigger part of it in the next 2 years leading up to the next election. So he's going to have to focus on policies. I would suggest things like childcare, things like that actually impact not only women's ability to get into the workforce, but actually help the economy overall.
But Susan, one of the Prime Minister's lucky breaks comes from a macroeconomic indicator, which has very micro implications, and that's housing prices. As long as we have a robust housing market, all those Canadians that own homes feel that they're definitely better off, feel that they definitely have more money. And that is something that inures the Prime Minister's benefit, even though it's not of his own making.
But there are those out there, and we've seen it reflected in some polling, that suggests that the government has not delivered enough 2 years in, halfway. David, where are they vulnerable?
Well, I think that there's you know, they probably lost a little steam on their economic agenda in the course of the last budget. I think the first budget really laid down some significant markers, as we've been talking about. And then the second budget really didn't seem to advance those as much. And so perhaps Canadians have gotten the impression that the government's taken its eye off the ball on this working class, middle class fairness issue and is maybe a little too focused on other kinds of things and perhaps advancing some identity politics agendas that people don't think are as important. And I think if they've got a weakness and a vulnerability, it's keeping their eye strongly focused on economic issues.
Kathleen, we've got a new Democrat leader and a new Conservative leader. How is that going to change the next 2 years for the government?
Well, the previous 2 years, they really haven't had any opposition, or at least their leaders haven't been established. So certainly I think that now there's Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh. The Parliament and politics are going to take a little bit different turn. I think in Jagmeet, New Democrats were, interestingly, they took a bit of a risk, but they also have some high rewards possibility. I think particularly when we look at things like Bill 62, this very hateful bill that's come out in Quebec, I think that his ability to wedge Justin Trudeau on this issue will be very effective.
Jamie, what about that Bill 62? Is there some sensitivity that the government should do something and isn't, or how is that going to play out?
Well, this Bill 62 is exactly the kind of problem Justin Trudeau doesn't want to have, because it runs completely contrary to his positive, upbeat, sunny ways agenda that he's been trying successfully to bring forward. And it's wedge politics. You know, that's why it's being done in Quebec. And it will give Mr. Singh an opportunity to wedge the Prime Minister. So I'll be very interested to see how he gets out of this pickle that he's going to find himself in. It's going to be ugly all the way around.
What's the pickle, David?
Well, the pickle is that there are a lot of people in Quebec who must support this measure, or the government wouldn't be introducing it. And I think that in English Canada, there are a lot of people that expect the government to stand up for individual rights and human rights and to shut down this and challenge this legislation. The problem is that is the quickest way to give the separatist element in Quebec their dream, which is that this turns from an internal Quebec argument to a fight between Quebec and the rest of Canada. And so I think it's far better for the feds to sit back and let a charter challenge come from inside Quebec rather than for the federal government to lead the charge in shutting down this legislation.
Going from that to immigration, we've heard a lot about the refugee issue, border crossers from America into Canada. People are unhappy with the illegality of that in some people's views. Is the government trying to manage that, and how are they doing, Kathleen?
Well, I think they were quite effective in their first few years in government, the first 2 years in government so far, in terms of embracing Syrian refugees. I think bringing in over 40,000, I believe, Syrian refugees into Canada. How that continues to play out in the years ahead, we'll see. I know that Canada has a strong program in terms of community support of refugees, in terms of family sponsors from communities. That's being exported now to the world. That's a good thing. But how the government manages it in terms of illegal border crossing, that presents a whole bunch of new problems for them.
David, what do you think on that? Is the government ahead of Canadians on that?
Oh, I don't think that there's much question that the government has a more liberal and open immigration policy than probably would be the consensus in the country, and that has generally been the case throughout different incarnations of governments in this country. And Canadians shouldn't be complacent about how open they are to newcomers. A lot of people are, but there's also a lot of pushback against this. So this is something that the government has to be careful to continually, and it's not just the government. This is something that requires all of the leaders of our country and all parties to speak toward, to make sure that there's a consensus at the official level around these things. That's why George W. Bush the other day was so interesting to say that bigotry has been emboldened in their country by Trump and by other conservatives. So it's really the job of all the leaders in the country to try to maintain a lid on what could be anti-immigration sentiment.
But Susan, you know, as generous as this country is towards newcomers and towards refugees, and it's very generous, Canadian people don't like queue jumpers. And so that's where the government and civil society generally have got a challenge on their hands. People who play by the rules and are admitted under various programs, refugee programs, immigration programs, one thing. People that walk across the border, jump the queue and whatever, that's something else. And that's where it gets tricky as a public policy issue.
So we've only got about a minute and a bit left. Kathleen, on the world stage, clearly Trudeau has made a name for this government. Canadians recognize that. Is that generally a positive thing at home, or are people saying that doesn't translate domestically?
Well, I think ultimately you can have as many columns as you want in Vanity Fair or The New Yorker about your socks or your hair or your international presence, and it doesn't really count for votes in rural BC or in central Saskatchewan. And that's ultimately what the party will be focused on in the lead up to the election in 2019. Liberals have to be careful of getting too close to the sun, that kind of arrogance and that entitlement. And sometimes those spreads, those large columns in magazines like Vanity Fair, reinforce that at a local level.
Okay, a quick word from each of you on that subject, Jamie.
Actually, I see it a little bit differently than Kathleen. I think that my colleagues in my London office tell me that Trudeau has made a massive change in brand Canada, and I think you're going to see that translate into all kinds of good things for the country. I think the media is going to start reporting that, and we're going to go from a fanboy kind of approach, which we have right now, to the actual benefit that reputation brings Canada as a whole. I think it is going to be a win for his party here.
David?
Justin Trudeau, because of his name recognition around the world, is the most important and most influential Canadian Prime Minister globally in history. On all of the big issues confronting the planet, climate change, migration of peoples, making globalization work, he's perceived as the exemplar of small L liberalism and the anti-Trump. This is an opportunity for Canada to exercise influence like it never has.
All right, good place to end. Thank you very much, David, Jamie, and Kathleen. I'm sure we're going to talk more about this as the days go on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks.